Okay, so I learned a little trick on how to install new tapered steering head bearings on a vintage Honda triple tree period. So this is from my 350 4-cylinder, just had it powder coated. Obviously got the old bearing off, and here is what's left of it. That's the old race. And we've got the new bearing, and it comes with 2 spacers, but for this one I'm going to use the narrower spacer. Here's the dust cap. Here's the other side, but for now I'm just going to show you how I get this on without a press. So what I've done is I've tapped the new race into my freshly powder coated frame, and that's in there real well. And what I did was using the broken piece of old race, tapping it in carefully just all around with this. All right, so pretty much you would put the spacer on and then the dust cap, and then the bearing goes on. Now obviously the bearing doesn't just slide down, it needs to be pressed down. And this is where I think it's very important to point out that when you look at the bearing, a lot of people use some kind of washer that presses the cage, and this is wrong. You do not want to press the cage. The only safe part of the bearing that you can press on is this part right here. Very important. So what have I done? I made this. This is just a simple washer. And if you look, this washer, and I machined it down using a Dremel, you can see how this washer sits only on the inner part of the bearing, so that when you apply pressure, you are not pressing down on the cage. If you press down on this, you will crush it and break it and ruin the bearing. You can only press down. So that's why I created, it's very, very thin. I just machined away most of the material until it was exactly fitting right here. Okay, so I've moved to the dining room, a little bit more space. So as you can see, I have on the spacer, the dust cap, the new bearing, and then most importantly, my little machined washer that only sits on the inner part of the bearing, so we're not going to be pushing down on the cage. And here's another washer that I also machined away some material to fit over to then press on the other washer. So again, nothing is pressing on the cage. And then you'll see what this contraption is for. This is just a standard threaded bar, a whole bunch of washers that I just grabbed from the garage, and then a piece of 1.5" threaded steel pipe. And this is going to act as the press. Okay, so I've passed the threaded bar through the center of the triple tree tube, have a few washers here just to protect this part, the triple tree, the spacer, the dust cap, the bearing that little thin washer that's only pressing against the inner part of the bearing. It's not pressing against the cage. A big washer to push against the little washer. This piece of pipe. A big washer to cap the pipe, and a few other washers to space down to the final nut. And all I'm going to do is turn this nut and this nut, and it will compress this, and it will push this bearing down into place. And this is done without a press. It's just my little contraption here. So all I'm doing is turning these while securing this one, and it will slowly move the bearing down into a pressed position. And here we have our freshly pressed on bearing. Works great. We only pressed on the inner ring, so we didn't damage the cage containing the bearing cylinders. And then here's my contraption, which I probably used to press on at least a half a dozen steering head bearings. They all seem to always be the same size. And again, the most important part are these dremeled out machined washers that ensure that you're only pressing on the inner ring and you are not pressing on the bearing cage. And here we are back in the garage. I just temporarily mocked it up with the other bearing, and perfect. Works great.